The dusty main street of Millbrook Falls stretched endlessly under the scorching sun, but today it felt different. Today, the entire town had gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on the wooden platform where Clara Morgan stood with her hands bound behind her back. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the air like a death sentence. One childless woman, age 26, good for household work and farming. What am I bid? But what the crowd didn't know was that somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats were thundering toward them, carrying a man with steel-gray eyes, a baby in his arms, and a determination that would shake this small town to its very foundation. Chapter 1. The auction block that morning had started like any other in the small frontier town of Millbrook Falls, nestled deep in the Montana Territory. The year was 1887. And life moved at the pace of horse hooves on dirt roads and the rhythm of hammers building a new world from raw timber and stubborn dreams. Clara Morgan had always known this day would come. She had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable. For 3 years she had been married to Thomas Morgan, the town's most prosperous merchant. For 3 years she had endured his increasingly cold stares, his sharp words about her failure as a wife, and the whispered conversations behind closed doors about her inability to bear children. Now, standing on the auction platform in the town square, Clara kept her chin raised despite the rope that bound her wrists. Her long brown hair, usually pinned up in a neat bun, hung loose around her shoulders. Her blue cotton dress, the nicest one she owned, was wrinkled from a sleepless night in the town jail, where Thomas had left her after filing the papers for dissolution of marriage due to barrenness and inadequacy. As a wife, the crowd gathered below her was a mixture of curious onlookers and potential bidders. Some faces showed pity, others showed hunger, and a few showed the cold calculation of men looking to acquire property rather than a human being. The practice was legal under territorial law. Failed wife could be auctioned to pay her husband's debts or simply to rid him of an unwanted burden. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Jeremiah Hooks, the town's official auctioneer, his voice carrying easily across the square. He was a thin man with a pointed beard and eyes like a hawk. "We have here Clara Morgan, formerly the wife of our esteemed merchant Thomas Morgan. As filed with the territorial court, this woman has proven unable to fulfill her primary duty as a wife." Clara's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that speaking up only made things worse. "She's 26 years old," Hooks continued, consulting his papers. "Healthy, able-bodied, skilled in cooking, cleaning, sewing, and general household management. She can read and write, which makes her more valuable than most. The starting bid is $50. A murmur rippled through the crowd. $50 was a substantial sum, enough to buy a good horse or several months' worth of supplies. Clara felt sick to her stomach as she watched the faces below, waiting to see who would claim ownership of her life. $50, called out Marcus Webb, the owner of the town's only hotel. He was a heavy-set man with graying hair, and a reputation for being hard on his workers. "I could use another pair of hands at the Hotel 60. This from Samuel Crenshaw, who ran the general store. Clara knew him to be a widower with 5 young children who had been struggling to manage his household since his wife's death the previous winter. The bidding continued, and with each raised price, Clara felt her future slipping further away from her control. She closed her eyes and tried to transport herself somewhere else. She thought about the small cabin she and Thomas had shared when they were first married, before his business became successful and he became obsessed with his standing in the community. She remembered when he used to hold her hand during their evening walks, before her inability to conceive became a source of shame that poisoned everything between them. $100. The voice was unfamiliar, and Clara opened her eyes to see a tall man in a brown duster coat pushing through the crowd. She couldn't see his face clearly from her position on the platform, but something about his presence commanded attention. The crowd fell silent for a moment. $100 was more than most people in Millbrook Falls made in several months. "100 going once," Hooks called out, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of a higher commission. 100. Marcus Webb wasn't giving up easily. The stranger in the duster coat stepped closer to the platform. $200. A gasp went up from the crowd. Even Thomas Morgan, who had been standing near the back with his arms crossed and a satisfied expression on his face, looked surprised. "Sir," Hooks addressed the stranger, "that's a considerable sum. Are you certain I said $200? The man's voice was calm but carried an undertone that suggested it would be unwise to question him further. "And I want this finished quickly." Clara finally got a clear look at the man who was about to purchase her. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and steel-gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His face was weathered from years under the sun, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he was no ordinary farmer or merchant. Most notably, he was carrying something carefully wrapped in a blanket, something that seemed to be moving slightly, undergoing once. Hooks called out, scanning the crowd for any other bidders. Going twice, ... double quotes, he paused, but no one else spoke up. $200 was far beyond what most people could afford. Sold, to the gentleman in the duster coat. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. At least Marcus Webb hadn't. Once she had heard enough stories about how he treated his female employees to know that it would have been a particularly unpleasant fate, but this stranger was an unknown quantity, and in her experience, unknown could be just as dangerous as known. The man approached the platform as Hooks began preparing the papers. Up close, Clara could see that what he was carrying was definitely small, very small. "What's your name?" she asked quietly as he stepped up onto the platform. "Nathaniel Reeves," he replied, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. "And you're about to find out that this whole situation is not what it appears to be." Before Clara could ask what he meant, a cry came from the bundle in his arms. A baby's cry. Chapter 2. The Revelation. The sound of the infant's wail cut through the noise of the dispersing crowd like a knife through cloth. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, and suddenly all eyes were back on the platform where Clara stood frozen in shock. Nathaniel Reeves carefully pulled back a corner of the blanket, revealing a tiny face scrunched up in distress. The baby couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, with wisps of dark hair and skin still bearing the delicate translucency of the newly born. "What ... double quotes," Clara breathed, her bound hands straining against the rope as every instinct in her body screamed to comfort the crying child. "Where did you get that baby?" Questions later, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice barely audible above the infant's cries. "Right now, this little one needs feeding, and you're the only woman here who looks like she has any idea how to handle a baby properly." He was right. Clara had helped deliver and care for dozens of babies during her time in Millbrook Falls. Despite being unable to have children of her own, it was one of the cruel ironies of her life. She seemed to have a natural gift with infants and small children, yet her own body had never been able to create the one thing she wanted most in the world. "Mr. Hooks," Nathaniel called to the auctioneer, who was staring at the baby with undisguised confusion. "I believe we need to finalize these papers quickly. This child needs care." Jeremiah Hooks fumbled with his documents, clearly flustered by this unexpected development. "Yes, of course, but, sir, you didn't mention a child when you registered to bid. There are additional fees for whatever the fees are. I'll pay them." Nathaniel's tone suggested that money was not a concern for him, which only deepened the mystery of who he was and where he had come from. As Hooks busied himself with the paperwork, Thomas Morgan pushed through what remained of the crowd, his face flushed red with anger and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at the baby. "That woman was barren. She couldn't conceive in 3 years of marriage. Where did that child come from?" Nathaniel turned to face Thomas, and Clara noticed that his hand had moved slightly closer to what appeared to be a gun holster beneath his coat. "Mr. Morgan, I presume, your former wife's fertility or lack thereof is no longer any of your concern. She belongs to me now, as do any children in her care." "That's impossible," Thomas sputtered. "She was examined by Dr. Hendricks. He confirmed that she would never bear children. And yet," Nathaniel said calmly, gently bouncing the crying baby, "here is a child who very clearly needs a mother's care. Are you suggesting I should let an infant suffer because of your former wife's supposed medical condition?" Clara watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. The baby's cries were becoming more desperate, and every fiber of her being was focused on the need to help the distressed child. But she was still bound, still technically property being transferred from one man to another, and still completely in the dark about what was happening. Dr. Hendricks himself emerged from the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He was an elderly man with kind eyes who had always treated Clara with gentle compassion during her examinations. "Mr. Reeves, if I may, perhaps I should examine the child. If it's ill, ... The baby isn't ill," Dr. Nathaniel replied, "just hungry and in need of proper care, which is why we need to conclude this business immediately." He turned back to Hooks, who was still fumbling with papers. "Is there anything else you need from me? Payment? Signatures? I have other matters to attend to." Just ... "Just your signature here, sir, and the payment of $200 plus the administrative fee of $10. Nathaniel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. He counted out the required amount without hesitation, then signed the papers with quick, efficient strokes. Mr. Reeves. Dr. Hendricks tried again. I really do think I should examine, Dr. Nathaniel interrupted, his voice taking on a harder edge. I appreciate your concern, but this child and this woman are now under my protection. If medical attention is needed, I'll seek it from someone I trust. The implication was clear. He didn't trust a local doctor. Possibly because Dr. Hendricks had been the one to declare Clara barren. The crowd was buzzing with whispered conversations, everyone trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. Thomas Morgan's face had gone from red to purple. This is fraud. That baby isn't hers. It can't be. Can you prove that? Nathaniel asked mildly. We were married for 3 years. And in those 3 years, did you never leave town? Never travel for business? Never leave your wife alone for extended periods? Thomas fell silent, clearly realizing the implication. If he admitted to being away from Clara for significant periods, it would open up the possibility that she could have conceived and borne a child during one of his absences. If he denied it, he would be admitting to keeping her under constant surveillance, which would make him look controlling and unreasonable. Mr. Hooks, Nathaniel said, turning back to the auctioneer. Are we finished here? Yes, sir. The woman is legally yours, along with any ... dependents. Nathaniel nodded and approached Clara. May I? He asked, indicating the ropes around her wrists. She nodded, and he produced a knife from his belt, cutting through the bonds with quick, efficient motions. As soon as her hands were free, Clara's arms went immediately toward the crying baby. May I? She asked, echoing his earlier question. Nathaniel hesitated for just a moment, then carefully transferred the infant to her arms. The moment Clara held the baby, something magical happened. The crying stopped almost instantly, replaced by the soft, contented sounds of a child who had found comfort. A collective sigh went up from the remaining crowd. Even Thomas Morgan looked shaken by the immediate bond between Clara and the infant. Someone in the crowd whispered, "She always was good with babies." Another voice replied. Clara looked down at the tiny face, now peaceful and alert, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of rightness, of purpose, of being exactly where she belonged. The baby's eyes were a deep blue-gray, not unlike Nath, and there was something about the child's features that tugged at her memory, though she couldn't place why. "What's the baby's name?" she asked softly. "Sarah," Nathaniel replied. "Her name is Sarah." Clara nodded, testing the name. "Hello, little Sarah," she whispered. "Don't worry, I'm going to take very good care of you." As if in response, baby Sarah made a small, satisfied sound and closed her eyes. "We should go," Nathaniel said quietly. "She'll be hungry soon, and there are things we need to discuss privately." Clara looked up at him, realizing she was about to leave everything she had ever known to follow a complete stranger. But as she looked down at the baby in her arms, she knew she would have followed anyone, anywhere. "To protect this child, I'm ready," she said. Chapter 3. Revelations. Nathaniel's horse was a magnificent black stallion tied to the hitching post outside the Millbrook Falls General Store. Attached to the horse was a small wagon loaded with supplies: baby bottles, cloth diapers, blankets, and what appeared to be enough provisions for a long journey. "You came prepared," Clara observed as Nathaniel helped her up onto the wagon seat, careful not to disturb baby Sarah, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "I had to," he replied, swinging up beside her and taking the reins. This wasn't exactly a spontaneous decision. As they rode through the town toward the outskirts, Clara noticed several people watching them from doorways and windows. News traveled fast in Millbrook Falls, and by evening, everyone would be talking about the mysterious stranger who had paid $200 for Thomas Morgan's barren wife and then produced a baby from nowhere. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following a dirt road that wound through rolling hills covered in prairie grass and wildflowers. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, but there was a gentle breeze that made the heat bearable. Baby Sarah slept peacefully in Clara's arms, occasionally making the small sounds that newborns make in their dreams. Finally, Nathaniel guided the horse off the main road onto a smaller path that led toward a grove of cottonwood trees near a stream. In the shade of the trees sat a small cabin, well maintained but clearly empty for some time. "This is where we're staying tonight," he said, climbing down from the wagon and coming around to help Clara tomorrow. "We'll continue on to my ranch." Clara accepted his assistance down from the wagon, still cradling Sarah carefully. "Mr. Reeves, I think it's time you told me what this is really about. Whose baby is this? And why did you pay $200 for a woman you'd never met?" Nathaniel was busy unhitching his horse, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "It's a long story," he said without turning round. We have time. Sarah won't need feeding for another hour or so. He finished with the horse and turned to face her. In the dappled sunlight filtering through the cottonwood leaves, she could see lines of fatigue and worry etched around his eyes. The baby, he said slowly, is my sister's child. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Your sister's? My sister Martha. She died 3 weeks ago, just days after giving birth. His voice was steady, but Clara could hear the grief beneath the controlled words. She wasn't married. The father disappeared when he found out she was expecting. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. She knew how devastating it could be for an unmarried woman to find herself pregnant, especially in small frontier communities where such things were rarely forgiven or forgotten. Martha came to live with me at my ranch when she started showing, Nathaniel continued. I hoped we could weather the scandal, but the birth was difficult, and she was never strong afterward. The doctor said her body just couldn't recover. Clara looked down at baby Sarah, trying to imagine the pain of a woman dying just days after bringing this perfect little life into the world. But why bring her here? Why the auction? Nathaniel ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Because I'm a single man with a ranch to run and no idea how to care for an infant. I tried for 2 weeks after Martha died, but Sarah wasn't thriving. She cried constantly, wouldn't take milk from a bottle, was losing weight. I was killing her with my incompetence. So you came looking for a woman who knew about babies. I came looking for you specifically. Clara stared at him. Me, but how did you even know I existed? Martha told me about you, he said, settling onto a fallen log near the stream. She lived in Millbrook Falls for a few months, about 4 years ago, working as a seamstress. She said there was a young married woman there who helped with all the births, who seemed to have a gift with children even though she couldn't have any of her own. She said this woman was kind and gentle, and that if anything ever happened to her, she would want someone like that to care for her children. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. She remembered Martha now, a quiet, dark-haired girl who had worked for Mrs. Patterson, the town's dressmaker. Clara had helped deliver 2 babies during the time Martha was in town, and she remembered the young woman watching from the doorway, taking in every detail of how Clara handled the newborns. I never thought ... double quotes Clara began, then stopped. I remember her, but I never imagined she would remember me. Martha never forgot kindness, Nathaniel said. When she was dying, she made me promise that if I couldn't care for Sarah properly, I would find you. She said your name was Clara, that you were married to the merchant Thomas Morgan, and that you would love Sarah as if she were your own. But how did you know about the auction? Nathaniel's expression darkened. I arrived in town yesterday, planning to approach you discreetly and ask if you might be willing to help care for Sarah, at least temporarily. I was prepared to pay you well for your services, but when I made inquiries, I learned about your ... situation, about your husband's plans to auction you off today. Clara felt a familiar stab of humiliation. Even strangers knew about her shame, her failure as a wife. I realized, Nathaniel continued, that this might actually solve both our problems. You needed to escape a bad situation, and Sarah needed a mother. So I decided to bid on you. You decided to buy me, you mean, Clara said, the words coming out more bitter than she had intended. Nathaniel looked stricken. Yes, technically. But Clara, I want you to understand something. I may have purchased your legal freedom from Thomas Morgan, but as far as I'm concerned, you're a free woman. You can leave any time you want. You can take Sarah with you if you choose. I have no legal claim on her anyway, since I'm not her father. All I'm asking is that you give us a chance. Clara looked down at baby Sarah, who was starting to wake up and make the small hungry sounds that meant feeding time was approaching. A chance for what? To be a family. Not a conventional one, maybe, but a family nonetheless. I have a good ranch, enough money to provide for us all, and Sarah needs a mother. You clearly have a gift with children, and you need a place where you'll be valued for who you are, not judged for what you can't do. The baby was becoming more insistent in her demands for food, and Clara realized they needed to address practical matters before continuing this conversation. Do you have milk? And bottles? In the wagon, Nathaniel said, jumping up immediately. I bought everything the general store had, but I'm not sure I got the right things. As Clara prepared to feed Sarah, using the supplies Nathaniel had brought, she found herself thinking about his proposition. A chance to be a family. She had given up on that dream 3 years ago when it became clear that she would never bear children. But here was a baby who needed her, and a man who seemed genuinely concerned with her welfare rather than his own convenience. Mr. Reeves, she said as she settled Sarah against her shoulder to burp after feeding. What happens if I say yes? What would our arrangement be? Call me Nathaniel, he said. And as for our arrangement, I suppose that's something we'd need to work out together. I'm not looking for a wife. If that's what you're worried about, I'm looking for someone to help me raise my niece. Someone who will love her and care for her as if she were their own child. And what about me? What would my life be like? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, staring out at the stream. Better than it was with Thomas Morgan, I hope. You'd have your own room, your own space. You'd be treated as a member of the family, not as a servant. And if you ever decided you wanted to leave, you'd be free to go with enough money to start a new life wherever you chose. It sounded too good to be true, which made Clara suspicious. In her experience, men didn't make generous offers without expecting something in return. What aren't you telling me? She asked. Nathaniel met her eyes directly. I'm telling you everything that matters. Yes, there are details we haven't worked out yet, practical things about living arrangements and day-to-day life. But the fundamental truth is simple. Sarah needs a mother, you need a new life, and I think we could all help each other. Clara looked down at the baby, who was now contentedly drowsing against her shoulder. In just a few hours, she had felt more useful and needed than she had in 3 years of marriage. Thomas had made her feel like a failure, but holding Sarah made her feel capable and valuable. Your ranch, she said. Where is it? About 2 days' ride north of here, up in the mountains. It's isolated, but beautiful, good water, fertile land, and far enough from any towns that people mind their own business, and you live there alone. I have 2 ranch hands who help with the cattle and horses. Good men, but neither of them knows the first thing about babies. He paused. Clara, I know this is all sudden and strange. I know you have every reason to be suspicious of my motives, but I give you my word as a gentleman that my only goal is to create a home where Sarah can grow up happy and loved. Clara stood up and walked to the edge of the stream, still holding the sleeping baby. The water gurgled peacefully over smooth stones, and somewhere in the trees a bird was singing. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace settling over her. When she turned back to Nathaniel, her decision was made. All right, she said, I'll come with you to your ranch. But I have conditions. Name them. If at any point I'm unhappy with the arrangement, I can leave with Sarah. I won't abandon this baby to someone who can't care for her properly. Agreed. I want to know everything about Sarah's mother, about Martha. If I'm going to raise this child, I need to understand where she came from. I'll tell you everything I know, and if we're going to live as a family, even an unconventional one, we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets, no hidden motives. Nathaniel nodded. No more secrets. As the sun began to set behind the cottonwood trees, Clara felt as if she were watching the end of one life and the beginning of another. Tomorrow she would be starting over in a place she had never seen, with people she barely knew. But as she looked down at baby Sarah's peaceful face, she knew she was making the right choice. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 4. The journey home. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and the promise of another hot day to come. Clara woke to the sound of baby Sarah fussing and realized with a start that she had slept better than she had in months. The simple cabin bed, with its clean sheets and handmade quilt, had been more comfortable than the ornate bedroom she had shared with Thomas Morgan. Nathaniel was already up, tending to his horse and packing their supplies into the wagon. He looked up when he heard Sarah's cries and gave Clara a questioning look. She's fine, Clara assured him, already reaching for the baby. Just hungry, like clockwork, every 3 hours. As Clara fed and changed Sarah, she watched Nathaniel work. He moved with the easy efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of himself and others. His clothes were well made but practical, and everything he did seemed purposeful and considered. It was a stark contrast to Thomas, who had always relied on others to handle any task he considered beneath his dignity as a successful merchant. How long will it take to reach your ranch? Clara asked as they prepared to leave. If we make good time, we should be there by tomorrow evening, Nathaniel replied, helping her up onto the wagon seat. But we'll stop frequently to rest and feed Sarah. I don't want to push too hard with a baby. They set out across the rolling prairie, following roads that gradually became more like paths and then like suggestions of directions through the grass. As they traveled, Nathaniel kept his promise to tell Clara about his sister Martha. She was 4 years younger than me, he began, guiding the horse around a particularly rocky section of ground. Our parents died when she was just 16 and I was 20. I inherited the ranch from our father, and Martha stayed with me for a while. but she always felt restless there, said it was too isolated, too lonely, so she came to Millbrook Falls. Among other places, Martha had a wandering spirit. She would stay with me for a few months, then decide she needed to see what was over the next hill. She worked as a seamstress in several towns, was quite good at it. She could make the most beautiful dresses from scraps of fabric. Remembered Martha's skill with needle and thread. Mrs. Patterson had been sorry to lose her when she decided to move on. She fell in love with a traveling salesman. Nathaniel continued, his voice becoming tighter. Fellow named James Crawford. He came through town selling dry goods, stayed for 2 months, swept Martha off her feet with promises of marriage and a grand adventure seeing the world together. But he left when she told him about the baby, disappeared in the middle of the night. Along with $50 Martha had saved up. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins. She came back to me broken-hearted and pregnant, convinced she had ruined her life and brought shame on our family. Clara felt a familiar ache in her chest. She knew what it was like to feel as if you had failed in your fundamental purpose as a woman, though for different reasons. You took her in. Of course I did. She was my sister, but she never really recovered from the heartbreak. She spent most of her pregnancy convinced that the baby would be better off without her, that she had nothing to offer a child. They rode in contemplative silence for a while, broken only by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the occasional sound from Sarah, who seemed content to sleep and wake and eat in the rhythm that all healthy babies establish. Clara found herself marveling at how quickly she had adapted to caring for the infant. It felt as natural as breathing, as if some part of her that had been dormant for years was finally awakening. Around midday, they stopped by a small stream to rest the horse and tend to Sarah, as Clara fed the baby. Nathaniel unpacked food he had brought from town: fresh bread, cheese, apples, and jerky. This is beautiful country, Clara observed, looking out over the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon in every direction. So peaceful it can be lonely. Though Nathaniel said, especially for someone used to town life. My ranch is even more isolated than this. I think I could get used to lonely, Clara replied. Town life has its own problems. As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Clara tensed, remembering that they were still only a day's ride from Millbrook Falls and that Thomas might have decided to follow them, perhaps with claims that the baby belonged to him or some other legal complication. But when the riders came into view, Clara didn't recognize them. 3 men on horseback, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested they spent more time in saloons than in church. They approached slowly, their eyes taking in every detail of Nathaniel's wagon and supplies. Afternoon, folks, the leader called out. He was a thin man with a scraggly beard and eyes that seemed to find everything amusing in an unpleasant way. Fine day for traveling. It is, Nathaniel replied carefully. Clara noticed that his hand had moved closer to his gun, though he kept his voice friendly and casual. Couldn't help but notice you folks seem to have some nice supplies there, the man continued, dismounting from his horse. His 2 companions followed suit, spreading out slightly in a way that seemed casual but struck Clara as anything but. Just the basics for traveling with a baby, Nathaniel said. Nothing that would interest you gentlemen, I'm sure. Oh, but you'd be surprised what interests us, the leader said with an ugly grin. For instance, that's a fine horse you've got there, and I'll bet there's money in those saddlebags. Clara felt fear creeping up her spine. She looked down at Sarah, who was still nursing peacefully, oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Gentlemen, Nathaniel said, standing up slowly, I don't want any trouble. I'm traveling with a woman and a baby. Surely you can find easier targets than us. But see, that's where you're wrong, the leader said, drawing his gun. Easy isn't always as profitable as it looks. What happened next occurred so quickly that Clara could barely follow it. Nathaniel's gun appeared in his hand as if by magic, and suddenly 2 of the 3 men were on the ground, and the leader was staring down the barrel of Nathaniel's Colt .45. Now, Nathaniel said in a voice Clara had never heard from him before, cold and deadly calm, I'm going to give you a choice. You can ride away right now and pretend you never saw us, or you can join your friends on the ground. Which is it going to be? The leader looked at his fallen companions, both of whom were groaning and clutching wounded arms. Then back at Nathaniel's steady gun hand. We'll be going, he said, backing toward his horse. Good choice. And gentlemen, if I see you again, anywhere, at any time, I won't be as generous as I'm being today. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away quickly, leaving Clara and Nathaniel alone by the stream. Clara realized she was shaking. Are you all right? Nathaniel asked, holstering his gun and moving immediately to check on her and Sarah. I think so, Clara managed. Nothing like that ever happened in town. I'm sorry you had to see that, Nathaniel said gently. But out here, sometimes you don't have a choice. Those men would have taken everything we had and left us stranded. Clara looked at him with new eyes. She had known he was different from the men in Millbrook Falls, but she hadn't realized just how different. The speed and skill with which he had handled the situation spoke of considerable experience with violence. Nathaniel, she said carefully, what exactly did you do before you became a rancher? He was quiet for a long moment, packing up their supplies and preparing to leave. When he finally answered, he didn't look at her. I was a lawman for several years, deputy marshal, then sheriff in various towns. I've seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, which is one of the reasons I retired to ranching. But you're still very good at it, at handling dangerous situations. It's not something you forget, he said simply. And out here, it's still a useful skill to have. As they continued their journey, Clara found herself thinking about this new information. She was traveling into the wilderness with a former lawman who carried himself like a gunfighter, to raise a baby whose mother had died of heartbreak, in a place so remote that dangerous men felt free to rob travelers in broad daylight. And yet, strangely, she felt safer than she had in years. Thomas had never been able to protect her from anything, not from gossip, not from his own cruelty, not from the legal system that allowed him to auction her off like property. But watching Nathaniel handle those men, she had seen something rare: competence, courage, and a willingness to act decisively when action was needed. More importantly, when the danger was over, his first concern had been for her and Sarah, not for his belongings, not for his pride, but for their safety and well-being. As the afternoon wore on and the landscape gradually changed from prairie to foothills, Clara allowed herself to imagine what life might be like at Nathaniel's ranch, a place where she would be valued for her skills rather than judged for her shortcomings, a place where she could raise Sarah in peace and safety, a place where she might finally find the sense of belonging that had